Let's move on for now. US Navy submarines should patrol Australian territorial waters with Australian crew members aboard as part of a major step up in American naval assistance ahead of the arrival of the country's own nuclear submarines. That's the view being put forward by a former US Navy Secretary. Richard Spencer, who was US Navy Secretary in the Trump administration between 2017 and 2019, is saying the challenge of a rising China means the US must do more to help defend Australia's maritime approaches before we acquire our own nuclear submarine fleet. Joining us live is Cameron Stewart. He's the Associate Editor at the Australian newspaper. Cam, really appreciate your time. Thank you. Just how significant would this sort of move be for Australia?
It would be significant, Ash, because it would really enmesh the two navies of US and Australia closer than ever before. It's quite a strong and reasonably radical prospect that Richard Spencer, the former US Navy Secretary, is suggesting. He's suggesting fairly quickly to try and put Australian crew members onto US Virginia-class submarines, and secondly, to actually have those submarines patrol closer to Australia than they have previously. In other words, he's actually almost advocating that the US Navy do more to directly defend the approaches to Australia in the years that we're going to be waiting for a nuclear-powered submarine fleet, which of course could be up to 20 years.
And do you think that's realistic? Have we seen any reaction from the government? Do we know the path that they're heading on here?
Look, really, the government would be supportive of this because Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, has said that he'd like to see Australian crews at some point get onto either the British or the American submarines to get training. What Richard Spencer is doing is pushing this forward. He's saying this should be done much more quickly, as fast as we possibly can. But it's going to be a long-term thing, prospect, because basically Australia hasn't got crews that are trained on nuclear-powered submarines, of course. We don't have any nuclear-powered submarines. It's going to take quite a long time to get those crews through the pipeline. About 20 or so of them are training overseas at the moment, but it's going to take quite a long time to get this happening. But what it really is saying, what Spencer is saying here, is that the US, he believes, should and will allow lots of Australian crews onto US submarines whenever they are fully trained. That's a big statement, it's a big commitment, and him saying that these submarines should patrol closer to Australia is also a big commitment. It really shows, I think, that, and Spencer has a good reading of the US administration, even though he's not in this administration. I think it shows that he believes that in Washington, it's really full steam ahead for AUKUS, and he's actually pushing it as hard, if not harder, than the Australian government at the moment.
China, I assume, wouldn't be too pleased at this suggestion?
They wouldn't be too pleased at the suggestion, but they'd be even less pleased at Richard Spencer's second suggestion, which is that the US actually base some of its Virginia-class nuclear submarines in Perth, base them or long-term secondment there, and that means effectively they're sitting there in Perth on a permanent basis. I mean, that is something that would really upset Beijing even more than Australian sharing the crews with the Americans. And of course, Beijing's media, state government media, last week had another sling at AUKUS, saying it was very dangerous and destabilising for the region. So look, this is a prospect which will not please China at all. But all of these, every single time that AUKUS comes together a little bit more, another inch forward, does upset Beijing. It's going to be a constant in Australia's diplomatic challenge, is to keep Beijing reasonably placated while we move this whole prospect forward, because it's a very long-term plan to get these submarines. And of course, we're going to have a really big moment in March, just a few months from now, when Richard Marles is going to look at the review of the Nuclear Submarine Task Force, and he's going to have to make massive decisions on exactly what submarine we get, how many we get, what costs they are, and what the timeline is. And I think that is the really big moment, and that will be a moment that will test Beijing like never before.
There has been so much debate about these submarines already. When you look at those questions that the task force is examining, when we look at what sort of submarine we get, is it looking likely that we'll go down the path of having that common design AUKUS submarine? Does that seem the most likely outcome?
Look, no one except a few people in Canberra know at the moment, Ash, but that's certainly a lot of speculation, a lot more speculation in Canberra behind closed doors at the moment, that there will be a common submarine between the three nations in the future. And that's basically a basic common submarine, maybe with slight changes for each country. Now, look, the benefit of that would be that there's a great economy of scale there. It's like the F-35 strike fighter. You know, you make it in a range of countries. You could make parts in various countries. But the problem with that is, you have to get 3 countries to agree on a design, and that's a big thing, especially between the British and the Americans, because the British normally have smaller submarines than the Americans. They've never done such a thing before. So it'd be a very big political decision, and it would be a challenge, and therefore I think it would take much longer to get a common design submarine than it would, for example, for Australia just to buy or build Virginia-class submarines, which are in the water. They're American submarines. They're the ones that are in the water at the moment. So, look, you know, these are the decisions they're going to have to make. But certainly that common submarine is, I understand, in the mix. It's likely to be one of the options that would be presented to the government, and we just have to wait and see which one they choose.
And in terms of the timeline, you mentioned this is a long-term plan. What is the expectation of how that timeline will track?
Well, that's really the really difficult question, because the bottom line is, no matter how you look at it, the Collins-class submarines are not going to really last until we get a nuclear-powered submarine. It's almost impossible to see how that's going to happen. The Collins-class submarines, all 6 of them, will have their life extended by 10 years from 2026, and so they'll start to peter out in the late 2030s, and you know they're getting old as well. And so there's going to be a question for the government as to, do they get an interim submarine? Do they get, for example, a couple of Virginia-class submarines off the production line in America? Or do they actually build some more Collins-class submarines here in Australia? And, you know, you can go out there in the strategic community, Ash, and there are very, very different points of view. And there's some people that are adamant we really need more Collins-class submarines because the gap will be too big. Other people saying, you know, the Navy can't cope with that many different classes of submarine. But these are big questions because they will cost a hell of a lot of money. I mean, the massive taxpayer bill here. And so, you know, Richard Marles has to get this right, because it's going to be such a cost. It's going to impinge on other areas of government spending, from health to education. And so, you know, it's very hard to think of a strategic decision Australia's faced in the last couple of decades that's been as important as this one.
No pressure on the Defence Minister. Cam Stewart, always appreciate your analysis with us. Thanks so much.